It all began back in 2006 with the US attempt to implement its new Middle East plan via the war on Lebanon. When this failed, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization acted to attack the US dollar, and at this point, should the US had done nothing, it would have faced a certain run on its currency. The neocons under Bush-Cheney then plotted the Georgia War, which was meant to put Russia face-to-face with NATO in Georgia. This plan blew up in their face the moment Russia threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons in Georgia should NATO remain in their positions. The planners had hoped that Russia would have let the Georgian attack on South Ossetia slide. They didn't, and we all know what happened next. What isn't widely advertised is that NATO effectively struck back by flooding the Black Sea with vessels, essentially cutting off Russia's Crimean port from safe access to the Mediterranean. That's when a certain character called Assad stepped in and opened up the Tartus port to the Black Sea fleet, effectively burning NATO's card as the Russian fleet could now safely amass in the Mediterranean. After this series of failures, confidence in US geostrategy collapsed, and with it, confidence in the US dollar and stock market. We all know what happened in September, and with that, the neocon team was finally out the door. While the neocons screwed up on the international scene, the establishment had been busy brewing up a plan B months earlier. It was a hot race between Obama and Clinton, with the latter strangely holding on to the race despite the guaranteed defeat she faced. Some strong indications that sabotage may have been on the table, but 2 days after an alleged power broker meeting at the Bilderberg 2008, Hillary pulled out. Obama himself ran a social media campaign in order to appear to be a grassroots contender. Many die-hard Obama fans believe they still own whatever he does or decides, which is why they can never fault his actions. At the time, the establishment was fixated on social media as it seemed to be a far easier way to sway the people than the traditional media that had lost credibility thanks to the war in Iraq. Trying their luck, a crude attempt was made to create a civil war in Iran back in 2009 via the Green Revolution, but this failed thanks to Iran's internet censorship apparatus. But it was an important event to note and a learning experience. At the time, the Russians were wooed into a cozier relationship with the US, with a new face of Obama in power, and agreed to a reset in relations. It was important to keep Russia hanging on for the next part, knowing that the SCO would continue to undermine the US dollar. By the start of 2010, the SCO was sure of their imminent victory. With gold bug rumours all around and the US dollar and economy rapidly declining, they asked for all kinds of concessions behind closed doors. They pressed the US to give Russia and China more say in the operation of the World Bank and IMF and the United Nations Security Council, this all the while that China expanded projects in North Africa. Convinced they had the US in a bind and that the US under Obama could not act in an aggressive way on the international scene, an expanded looser alliance under the term BRICS met to discuss a gold-backed currency for international settlements. This currency was essentially a means of undermining the US dollar as a stable reference used to sign off on pricing agreements between nations, mainly on supplies of energy, which are signed over many years. The US dollar is one of the most important assets available to the US, besides the military, so this would have delivered a death blow to the US's ability to project power around the world and specifically around the SCO. However, the adversaries of the West were prematurely celebrating their victory while the US was readying itself to deliver the coup de grace. Having learnt from the failed Green Revolution in Iran, a much lower key revolt was brewed on social media, one that only North Africans paid close attention to: the Tunisian Revolution. On the face of it, this one made no sense. Unlike in Iran, the ruling party in Tunisia had strong connections to the US, and there was no logical reason for the US to want it out of power. But this wasn't about logic, but emotions. Specifically, the emotions of the Arab population and the decision-making processes of the rulers around the world. The leaked US embassy cables were extremely embarrassing to the Tunisian government, as it detailed US-Tunisian anti-terrorism cooperation that many in the mostly banned Muslim Brotherhood offsuits saw as treachery. Whether it was decided to deliberately leak these cables or not cannot be proven, but what is undeniable is that they lit a fire that started the Arab Spring. The ruling party of Tunisia had collapsed by January 2011. Days later, longtime US ally Egyptian President Mubarak came under a similar but far more coordinated social media attack. The Twitter and Facebook spheres encouraged mass demonstrations in Cairo and other cities. The Egyptian government pulled the plug on the internet, but this backfired thanks to a kind of Streisand effect, where an act of mass censorship only makes a public revolt worse. The whole world was watching on Al Jazeera and other channels and celebrated when Mubarak stepped down after Obama asked him to. Russia and China did not understand how to read this move. They assumed the US was attempting to restabilize allied nations. Iran was ecstatic, knowing that an Islamist government will inevitably come into power now that the military-run government had collapsed under the wave of popular revolt. Knowing that Egypt was a long-time US ally, they concluded that the social media attack against the Egyptian government was grassroots-based. This could not have been further from the truth, and underestimating US planning would cost all these states dearly. The Muslim Brotherhood was now aligned with the US and was simply carrying out the original plans that in 2006 had started the coordinated attack against the US dollar. On February the 17th, simultaneous days of rage were announced in Syria and Libya. The Syrian day of rage fizzled out thanks to strong security apparatus that monitored the internet and preempted all security breaches. Libya was a different matter. It almost immediately escalated to an armed conflict where the army had split. The US and France brought a humanitarian proposal to the United Nations Security Council to enforce a no-fly zone on Libya that Russia and China de facto accepted. France immediately broke the terms of the resolution to attack the Libyan army on the ground and destroy its infrastructure. Barely sobering up from its celebrations, China left North Africa with its tail between its legs. Its Russian friends let it down by abstaining and not putting any pressure on France. It was, in fact, in Russia's interest to allow China to take the fall here, as it would force it to align more strongly with Russia in the future. But Russia didn't have long to laugh, as it would soon meet its fate too. The civil war in Syria was restarted with subtly armed protesters and a reorganized social media campaign. However, the delay had given Assad enough time to study the dynamics of the situation. The government there concluded that censoring the internet would backfire, as it did in Libya and Egypt. They concluded the only way to keep things under control was to monitor the internet and use any means to de-anonymize it and to work out the ringleaders of the revolt and those who communicate with foreign agents. This is a very important point for later, so keep it in mind. Although the US was in much better shape than it was in 2006, Russia and China could still recover from the Arab Spring and could still take down the US dollar. This is when things started escalating seriously. By March 2013, the war in Syria had been turned around and the Muslim Brotherhood was losing badly. The US could not directly intervene as the US population was completely against it. The social media mechanizations that were used to launch the Arab Spring were long discredited in the eyes of those spreading information, and Obama and Kerry were not able to use it to convince the masses of their narrative. In the end, the US had to concede to Russia, who offered a way out of the mess of Obama's creation, a cross-concession. The US agrees to stop funding the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria and refrain from threats to the Syrian military, and in return they hand over their chemical weapons. This was aligned with US regional objectives, so it was an offer that Obama could not refuse. So Plan C was set into motion. The Ukraine scenario. Failing to force the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of its Tartus port, the plan was set into motion to force it out of the Black Sea itself, rendering it worthless as Tartus was a small port and not directly connected to Russian military industry. Using social media again, and using long-harboured misgivings within the Ukraine, the US State Department launched a $5 billion campaign to take down the neutral regime in Ukraine and replace it with a US-aligned one. Russia attempted to counter by releasing details of the attempted coup, but the establishment media made a good attempt at suppressing them, and it went ahead. Russia had overestimated the importance of narrative, but the US had noted how disrupted the leak had been to its timetable. The EU and the US were euphoric. Without Ukraine, Russia could never be a strong power, according to Zbigniew Brzezinski. Russia was then forced to act in a manner that would destroy its public relations. Russian troops, stationed in Crimea and aided by special forces that infiltrated all government sectors with the support of much of the population, took over Crimea without firing a single bullet. Though not ideal, this was just the incident needed by the US to turn around the good faith among people that Russia had been brewing on the internet for years. Both the Arab Spring and the coup in Ukraine had utilized a powerful weapon, social media. When one creates a weapon, they're usually also working on its counter. A year after the attempted coup in Iran, an attempt was made by Joe Lieberman and other senators to introduce an internet kill switch. Various excuses were made for the proposal, but the only reasonable one is fear of a nationwide revolt. But the plan was flawed, as was seen in the Arab Spring. The Tunisian government enacted a crude form of an internet kill switch, and the government fell. Egypt's government had enacted a more robust kill switch, and it also fell. The only state that had avoided using an internet kill switch was Syria, and its government was still in power. It was clear that simply jamming a signal was not enough to calm people down and bring them back home, certainly not in the US, where people are largely sedated through internet-borne entertainment. Needless to say, the internet kill switch plan was shelved. Something more subtle was required. In 2013, an important event occurred that most geopolitical analysts misinterpreted: the Snowden surveillance leaks. Snowden's ultimate motivation doesn't matter. What matters is how the leaks affected the population's behaviour. To be specific, the chilling effect it caused. Knowing you are constantly monitored changes the way you behave. It forces you to restrict the topics that you are willing to discuss. You should know this well, as the social justice warrior's weapon of choice is doxing. Exposing people's true identity brings all the consequences of their institutional and employment mechanizations from the online discourse into the real world. People have now largely accepted the surveillance, and a few more intelligent people have moved on to encrypted communication. But conversing with each other is useless when we want to get a word out. What we really need is anonymity in social media. This is the element that allows a revolt to take place, whether against game journalism or a sudden unpopular ruling regime. Anonymity is currently required to go against the narrative when your very livelihood is threatened by the easily offended. Facebook took things one step further and added an algorithm where stories that are marked as fake are suppressed in a feed, not completely censored. This avoids bringing attention to the act of censorship and sidesteps the Streisand effect. But why are the leading figures of the US establishment fearing some sort of revolt? Things aren't great at the moment, but there's nothing really pushing people to move against the ruling oligarchy. This is where things get dark and the background to all this begins to make sense. If you've noticed a recurring pattern so far, every plan that has been put forward has actually failed to achieve its objective. But there's always been a contingency plan running in parallel that catches up and continues. This is the normal way a learned strategist works, and though it is a slow and delicate process, no state can afford to work in a straight line. The US is in total diplomatic and economic war with Russia, and Russia is losing military and diplomatic clout daily. Russia's allies, such as Belarus, judge it by its ability to protect its own interests in the Middle East. If it cannot protect itself, what chance of it protecting them should they become the victims of fourth-generational warfare like the US had utilized during the Arab Spring? This is true for the BRICS as well. Their plan to effectively bankrupt the US is ongoing and involves hoarding precious metals and dominating energy trade. Let me make one thing clear. I don't think nuclear war is likely, in the short term at least. Neither does any of the states involved. But even a small and growing likelihood must be accounted for. In game theory, the end game conditions will affect the decisions made right now, and to be completely informed about the real reasons for moves, you must be aware of the win condition of a state and the different threats that it faces. This is where the state of missile defense enters the equation. Without much fanfare, the US restarted its ABM program at the end of 2001. What most aren't aware of, however, is that Russia already had a proven ABM system that also utilizes nuclear-tipped missiles such as the SH-08 that can down most weapons around a certain perimeter. Russia has also developed a new system, potentially a satellite killer, with an EKV, that's an exo-atmospheric kill vehicle. But with no one paying attention to the collective security agreements any longer, it has not made it public. China made its EKV public in 2007 through a missile test. Russia is currently aiming to complete its S-500 program that is said to have the ability to shoot down any space object, including hypersonic missiles, by 2017. In most likelihood, it has been delayed several times due to the economic warfare faced by Russia. It won't be completed until 2019. Similarly, the final phase of the US ABM system will be completed around 2019-2020, going by the program's schedule. In parallel with missile defense, the Russians have been building up their nuclear stockpile, which now far exceeds that held by the US. But despite this advantage, and its Kaliningrad site outfitted with ABM-proof SS-26 hypersonic missiles, the US still holds the first strike advantage over Russia. In the terms of the outcome of such an exchange, the two states are held at parity, thanks mainly to Russia's automatic retaliation system. When the survival of the majority is threatened by an internal or external cause, the elite will act in a manner that protects them primarily and secondarily protects the majority, until that majority begins to threaten the elite. Traditionally, at that point in time, the security apparatus is activated against the people and a civil war breaks out. Without outside support, the theory goes, the security apparatus will win. Should the confrontation continue between the great powers, and at the current rate things are going, that looks to be the case. Eventually, one or more of them will enter a state of effective bankruptcy. With the missile defense systems coming online in 2019 to 2020, the decision makers in power will have at least the illusion of an unpunishable first nuclear strike. But should the state accept its fate of bankruptcy, as the Soviet Union did in the 80s, it will ultimately face the consequences of civil war. It is thus important to keep people uninformed about the risks at play. At the same time, it's important to demonize the other states in order to set the narrative for the population and keep the threat at hand credible. After all, the US military is composed of the US people, and if the elite are seen driving the US people to certain death over nothing but their own survival, the military will refuse or force them out of power. If, however, the accepted narrative is that of an external state threatening the existence of the US and behaving in an aggressive, irrational manner, the military is compelled to go along with the population's will or be seen as traitors. The phenomenon of social justice warriors is likely a manifestation of these attempts at psychological warfare called social engineering. Instead of the majority of people taking those with a truly privileged position to task, the majority gets locked in a war amongst each other, male against female, black against white, and so on. A lukewarm civil war now brews in the West with both right and left-wing elements. The dynamics favour the left thanks to decades of social engineering by both local and foreign, i.e. the now defunct Soviet Union, agents. When the left fails, selective enforcement and institutional corruption is used to set a narrative that allows them to effectively bypass reality. The left is chosen not out of preference of the elite, but because the logical conclusion is pure nihilism and complete chaos among the poor and middle-class citizens of the West. At the same time, the same mechanizations that favour the SJW narrative are used to cover up the international realities that ultimately affect Western citizens. The Western people will believe they are locked in battles that are far more important to them than what's going on in Azerbaijan or Ecuador. These issues are covered, but without the context of the bigger picture, the blame is incorrectly directed at the mechanizations rather than the mechanizers. As long as the system grinds on, the masses can never threaten the elite and will eventually be forced to hand over all their rights, thanks to the views of an increasingly growing minority who favour authoritarianism over freedom. When you look at the big picture, it's not hard to get overwhelmed by how things relate to each other. But we have to go through one more step to understand why a long-term project such as social engineering education can possibly be related to war. Let's consider briefly one possible outcome for the international conflict that has been outlined in this video. Russia and China fold. They accept all terms and conditions of the Western elite. There is a single monopoly of power in the world, with an international surveillance over every human being and censorship to prevent revolts. But unknown to the security apparatus, all of the mechanizations would have worked to serve a dual purpose. The elite have as long as they want to run their social engineering programs and will naturally take a path that serves their interests alone as established individuals. A culture destroyed by social engineering would have effectively reduced the risk to the elite to zero and brought them back to a feudalistic scenario that heavily favours the established. Human populations will be treated as they always have been, as nothing more than cattle, and the traditional means of controlling cattle is implemented. All kinds of insane justifications will be used to commit acts of mass barbarity or pure ignorance, just like in the Dark Ages, with a new religion based on slave morality. A brave new world, utopia for the establishment, a hellish dystopia for what will be left of their servants. In the other potential outcome to this scenario, either the US, Russia, or China will overstep the other sometime after the missile defense shields are up and running. Misinformed about the effectiveness of the ABM system, a leader decides to launch a conventional strike against a high-value target, or invade a territory controlled by another state, or launch de-escalation strikes through the use of tactical nuclear weapons in order to force a peaceful conclusion to a conflict. Long before the risk of nuclear war becomes a reality, the elite power base on both sides and their extended families, aka our best and brightest, will have secured their safety in the form of underground bunkers. The good news is the majority of nuclear weapons will not even take off from their bases or bunkers. Both sides, worried about each other's nuclear stockpiles, rather than annihilating the other's population, will target those alongside the ABM systems. The majority of nuclear weapons will be destroyed in their sites. However, both sides will dedicate at least some forces to cripple the other's economic and political power base. Majority cities will be targeted alongside heavily industrialized areas. The bad news is, regardless of the target, the radioactive contamination will spread far and wide, destroying much of the soil relied upon to obtain food. Life will be uncomfortable for those secured in the bunkers, but harsh for those living on the surface. Then there will remain only one logical concern for all elites: those on the outside attempting to break into their bunkers.